Yeah, thank you, Mary. Yeah, I'll let you know, but just if someone's unmuted and they don't realize it, some things like that would be great. And hi, everyone. We'll get started maybe in about 5 minutes. We'll go ahead and wait another minute or so. It's a nice time just to say hello to the community that we're practicing with, either just by looking to see who's here and just feeling that connection, or putting something in the chat if you feel like it. And you probably noticed that I've spotlighted myself, but you can always choose the gallery view. I'm assuming you all know where to find that in the upper right corner. And I am recording. That's why with the spotlighted, then only my video gets recorded, but people's voices will be recorded and will be up on our YouTube channel for people to listen to if they want at some other time. Really nice to be here. You probably heard that Shelley Graff has been out on the East Coast teaching a retreat at Insight Meditation Society. And tonight they're giving a public talk at Cambridge Insight Meditation Center in Cambridge, Massachusetts, right outside of Boston. Some of you know where that is. So Shelley will be flying home tomorrow. So Shelley invited me to sub for them and mentioned that you had been going through the Eightfold Path and now are on wise mindfulness. So as we settle into our sitting time, just even that transition of listening to our body and finding a comfortable posture for the meditation, even that, of course, requires mindful awareness, just that receptive, non-judging, open sense of the sitting body. And with that receptivity, we'll have a sense of what adjustments might be helpful, or whether it might be helpful to take a couple of longer, deeper breaths, filling the lungs, emptying the lungs a few times. Or even whether it would be helpful to invite a particular place in the body to release, like if we're holding tension in the jaw or tension in the abdomen. And just a simple intention, like, oh yeah, honey, maybe that can soften. So taking care of your posture, your body, we cultivate a relatively still, relatively relaxed and upright sitting posture. And perhaps even sensing a subtle pleasure of being present with our body, with the present moment. And that pleasure of being present, it really is related to that, to this fullness of awareness, this interest. And often it's useful to direct the attention to the sensations of the sitting body, or more specifically to the sensations of breathing in and breathing out. So we can use a more specific aspect of the present moment to sense that capacity we have to have a full, inclusive, non-judging awareness of the present moment through the use of a particular meditation anchor, like awareness of the whole body sitting, or awareness of the breathing process as it comes in and goes out. And even though we often, at least at times, work with a meditation anchor, using the totality of the body as a meditation anchor, or using the more specific sensations of breathing in and breathing out as an anchor, or some people even use hearing as an anchor for their awareness practice. awareness practice. So even though we have these anchors that we'll train with, we'll use, of course, other predominant experiences will arise, like thoughts, worrying, planning, whatever, or other disturbances. And then in that moment, or for a few moments, that disturbance, that distraction will be what awareness knows. Oh, now this is being known. This includes any reactivity. Oh, okay, the heart's reacting, getting tight, becoming aversive, and this is being known. Feels like this, and this underlying feeling of aversion is being known. It's just this experience being known. And so in those moments, for as many moments as needed, then the so-called distraction becomes the object of awareness. So in that sense, it's not really a distraction, it's just the next thing being known or being felt. And that's really how we build continuity, not so much by not having distractions, but rather being aware that a distraction is just what it is. It's that experience being felt or being known. And finally, because tonight we'll be talking and discussing together about what mindfulness is, what mindful awareness is. Really invite yourself when you've been lost in thought for some time, and really take the time to remember, as if for the first time, remember, well, what is it now in this moment to be aware of the present moment? To remember to recognize that this is being known. So even if that happens dozens and dozens of times during the next 30 minutes, where we begin again and we remember as if for the first time, oh, this experience is being known. And then doing our best to learn how to sustain that present moment awareness, either with the anchor or with any distractions that are interrupting the attention to the anchor. In the end, it's just something being known, the next experience being known, recognizing that it's being known. So with that in mind, let's have some silent practice time now. Once we have a sense of what it is to be mindfully aware, then in this non-judging way of being interested, how might it be possible to develop the continuity of present moment awareness, this not forgetting the present moment, keeping the present moment in mind. So you have 5 minutes or so to practice silently, and just to learn something about what supports the continuity and learning what gets in the way. And again, what practitioners have found to be supportive of the deepening and building the continuity of mindful awareness is by noticing that there is a subtle pleasure in being present. And it's the noticing of that subtle pleasure. It's a pleasure of simplicity and a pleasure of fullness. And if we can learn to keep that in mind, to recognize that and keep it in mind, it can really support the building of the momentum of awareness, present moment awareness. We might even intuit the sense of freedom, the sense of being peaceful with the conditions, not pushed around, not dependent, but peaceful with the conditions that are coming and going now in our experience. And that flavor of freedom has this paradoxical quality where, on the one hand, there's a real sense of intimacy and even vulnerability with the way it is right now. But on the other hand, there's a quality of immunity, like not feeling burdened or pushed around by what's coming and going in our experience. So both intimate, but also free of being pushed around or free of being burdened by what's being experienced. And this is really the taste, the intuitive taste of awakening, is freedom with the messiness, or freedom with the activity of the mind and the activity of the body just as it is. Not having to be in conflict with anything. And take a little time. Feel free to move your body any way that might be helpful for you. Stretch a little or stand or whatever feels right. And again, it's nice to be together tonight. Connect with the Wednesday night community. So I thought I would say a little bit about my own understanding of what wise mindfulness, mindful awareness, being open, being present. We have different ways of translating that word. Sati is the Pali. And more and more, I like to have awareness in it. So either mindful awareness or just present moment awareness, or awareness is usually how I refer to it. And I think the first thought I have about that is we need a lot of humility, because it's so not our habit, initially at least, to be mindfully aware. And we need to distinguish in our mind the difference between being conscious, and being mindfully aware, because they're obviously related. And the example I often give, many of you have heard me give this, but if you had to drive from point A to B, like driving home from work, clearly, to do that effectively, you need to be conscious. But you don't need to be aware, because we can do, those sort of things we've done before on autopilot. So there's consciousness as you make the right turns and slow down so you don't run into the person in front of you and those sorts of things. But you could come walking in the door and your friend or whoever is there at home says, "Well, how was the drive home?" And you realize, I just wasn't aware. I got here, of course, but there was no present moment awareness. There was none of that remembering to recognize what consciousness is illuminating. So consciousness just always is illuminating, like the person in front of me is getting too close, right? And that allows that kind of part of the mind to discern, I should slow down, otherwise I'm going to run into their bumper. So there is that, but it doesn't mean that that part of the mind, let's call it wisdom, is aware, is remembering to be aware, oh, I'm seeing that car and that's being known right now. Oh, I'm discerning I should slow down, and I can be aware of that discernment. If I don't slow down, I'm more likely to hit that person, or I better switch lanes, or whatever the discernment might be. And there's a real relationship between the presence of mindful awareness, that reflective, this is being known, or reflective, this is what the mind is knowing. This is what consciousness is knowing, or this is what the mind is doing right now. It's like we're holding up a mirror that reflects what the mind is knowing, what the mind is doing. So there's this reflective knowing in real time what's being known. So hopefully that's not intellectually too confusing. But the key is, as convoluted as it can seem when someone like me is trying to define what sati or mindful awareness is, the key will be for you to play with your own present moment experience so that you have an immediate sense of what it is when there's mindfulness and what it is when there isn't. When the mind is on autopilot or lost in thought. So thinking but not aware, it's just thoughts. One of the things about mindfulness, and this is a subtle but really important point, it isn't something that you or I do. So that's often how we hear, because we're more familiar with that. Oh, I need to do this. And so it must require some willful application of my mind to the task of being mindfully aware. I have to do it. But it's more something that we recognize and we keep in mind. So that mirror-like reflective knowing, oh, it's like this is being known, this is being known. We need to recognize that. We don't do it, but we recognize it. Like right now, let's just experiment a little bit. Whether I'm talking or not, or, there could be recognizing that looking at the screen is like this, or hearing Mark's voice is like this, or feeling the sensations of the sitting body is like this. But there are ways, right? You can invite that remembering that this present moment is already being known. Like the mind already has the capacity to recognize what consciousness is illuminating. And consciousness is always illuminating a lot. There's just so much happening in any moment, even in relatively simple, ordinary moments like this one is for most of us. Right? Because there are so many, even within one sense realm, like seeing, there's so many different sights being seen, so many different sounds being heard, so many different sensations being sensed, so many thoughts and other mental activities being perceived, being known, being recognized. So it's a bit of a madhouse of activity, the present moment. So when we cultivate that reflective knowing, that's why we sometimes rely in terms of training on a meditation anchor, because it simplifies the learning of how to keep remembering, oh yeah, there is this awareness of what's being known, and to keep it in mind. And so if we're just using, for example, the breath as an anchor, then it's not so much about focusing the attention on the breath, because the sensations of breathing are already, the system is already sensitive to physicality, including the physicality of breathing in and breathing out, the physicality of sitting. It's just that the mind has to remember that it's being known, because most often we're forgetful. Because if we were reflectively aware of everything the mind was conscious of, it would be a little overwhelming or a lot overwhelming. So there's, part of the just the way the mind has learned to operate is to, not pay attention to everything, not be aware of everything. But the interesting thing we learn about awareness is awareness, mindful awareness. It doesn't really have a problem. What has a problem is the mind that is interpreting an experience. Like if we feel there's too much happening, then the thought can arise, oh, there's too much happening. And that identification with that thought creates the appearance of somebody having a problem. But one thing that will help you get to know mindfulness is it fundamentally never has a problem with what's being known. So even pain doesn't mean that there won't be aversion, but the aversion to the pain isn't the mindfulness. Mindfulness can be reflectively aware. There is this throbbing ache in my knee, and mindfulness can be aware there is this part of the mind that is hating that throbbing pain in my knee, and there's this other part of the mind that's ashamed for being so averse to the pain in the body, But mindfulness is, by its very nature, it's like a mirror, doesn't get disturbed by what it's reflecting. That quality of mind that we call sati, or mindful awareness, that recognizing the present moment, it fundamentally remains unaffected. So whatever filter, like whatever mood or having a lot of greed or having a lot of aversion or having a lot of superficiality, those kinds of filters, that's not mindfulness, because mindfulness can recognize, oh, that's the way it is. That filter, that mood, that attitude of mind is there, and it's being known. This is one of my teachers, Sayadaw Tejaniya, said this once. Because we want to learn about the nature of the mind and objects, we don't try to calm the mind down or try to remove objects. We don't interfere or control, but observe, because we want to understand the mind and objects in their natural state as they are happening. This is called right view. So, in short, we often say, you probably have heard teachers say this a lot, recognize what's being known. And this is a non-judging awareness, right? So we use that non-judging because that really helps. If there is this appearance of me trying to control my experience or evaluate my experience or analyze my experience or judge my experience, that's not the awareness, that's some other activity of mind, some habit to relate in a judging way, or some aversive reaction to what is unpleasant, and then I'll judge it or I'll compare, or even if it's pleasant, I can compare, boy, it's never been this good before, the amount of calm or pleasure in my sitting practice, I always want it to be this way. So it could be greed. But whatever the attitude might be, whatever the reaction might be, it's just another thing that's there that can be known with awareness. Oh, there's this attitude in mind. So that's helpful to know that mindfulness, as I'm sure all of you know who've been practicing, it has that receptive quality to it. Doesn't mean it can't be really powerful. It can be really powerful. We sometimes think that for something to be powerful, it needs that aggressive or assertive energy, get in there. And we always think that would imply that there's somebody who's willfully trying to make something happen. But that soft power of awareness, that mirror-like receptivity, it really forces the activity we call me, the activity of the body and the mind, this activity of my life, it's forced to reveal itself precisely because we're not identified with any of it. We're kind of we're training the mind to take the role of the one who knows, of awareness, mindful awareness, that mirror-like reflective knowing, right? So then the activity of the body, the mind, which is really everything that we normally associate with me, it's just doing its thing. It's forced just to, we're just being who we are, thinking, the body, external activity, internal activity. Nature is just being nature. And that part of the mind we call sati, mindful awareness, simply reflects it back, in a sense, to itself. It's like this. This is being known. This is being felt. And so the wisdom function of the mind gets a clean, pure, immediate view of the way it is, of the nature of the body and the mind, the nature of me, the nature of my life, undistorted by interpretations. It's kind of like we're letting the body and the mind rip, just letting it do its thing. And we're putting all of the emphasis not in trying to be a good human being or a peaceful human being or a wise human being, but in being aware. Oh, it's like this, it's like this, it's like this, with some continuity to build that momentum. Because that soft power to just simply not judge, but to reflect, then wisdom really sees something about the nature of the mind, the nature of experience that it hasn't seen before. And basically what it sees, you've heard, a lot of you have heard this in different ways. It sees that this activity of me, of my life, this body and mind, external, internal, that this activity, it doesn't see so much what it is, it sees what it isn't. It's just all this being known, and it isn't anything else. So we say, in Buddhism, it's empty of anything else. It's empty of like a me, a kind of entity, permanent me back there. It's just something being known. We never find more than that. Something being known, something being known. Every single moment of every existence is always this experience, whether it's more of a inclusive experience at the present moment or awareness of something more specific in the present moment, but still it's just something being known. And that something in a moment might be a reactive emotional response. Okay, that's being known. Or it might be a lot of peace and settledness. Okay, peace and that settled feeling is being known. But every moment is always something being known. And the transformative insight is realizing that that's all there is, because it interrupts and uproots a wrong view in the mind, which is we think what this is our normal interpretation. There's somebody, me, struggling to have a good life and to, get my act together and to keep my mind calm and keep my body healthy and make friends and make amends when I screw up. But in any case, it feels like a burden human existence. Feels like a burden, even when we've got a pretty good run of it. Still sort of a burden being human, always. But the more we understand awareness and how awareness allows wisdom to deepen and widen, and then we begin to deepen this, transform our understanding, so that our understanding becomes more and more in line with reality. And that's really the point of wise mindfulness, sati, is it's kind of the central supporting cause for the deepening of insight, for the awakening process. Let me read you from Bhikkhu Bodhi. There's a sweet little book for serious practitioners. I recommend you get a copy. You can get it digitally for free online, or you can order yourself a paper copy from your bookstore. But it's The Noble Eightfold Path by Bhikkhu Bodhi, and maybe Shelley has shared that with you over the course of your study of the Eightfold Path. But it's a pretty thin book, and he writes in a sort of formal way. Bhikkhu Bodhi, he's a Westerner, I think from New York City originally. He's quite old now, maybe early 80s. For many decades, he lived in Sri Lanka. He ordained as a younger man, but so has been a monk for many decades now. But he's, as an older person, at a monastery in, I think it's outside of New York City, maybe in northern New Jersey, Bodhi Monastery. So Bhikkhu Bodhi in this book, he just has a chapter on each of the eightfold limbs, or the 8 limbs of the Eightfold Path. And this is the one on right mindfulness, or sama sati. Sama, it gets translated as right, but it means awareness, mindfulness that's in line with Dhamma the way it is. So mindfulness that is onward leading, that reflective awareness that's onward leading to the deepening of insight, of understanding. So I'll just read a couple paragraphs from this chapter. The mind, he writes, the mind is deliberately kept at a level of bare attention, a detached observation of what is happening within us and around us in the present moment. In the practice of right mindfulness, the mind is trained to remain in the present, open, quiet, and alert, contemplating the present event. All judgments and interpretations have been suspended, or if they occur, just registered and dropped, right? Because we're not feeding anything, we're taking the role of that reflective mirror that doesn't judge, it just reflects, this is being felt. This is being known. Now it's like this. Without those words, of course. Although, sometimes you might, if your mindfulness is wavering, you can use that word. Or that phrase rather, this is being known. The task is simply to note whatever comes up just as it's occurring, riding the changes of events in a way a surfer rides the waves of the sea. The whole process is a way of coming back into the present, of standing in the here and now, without slipping away, without getting swept away by the tides of distracting thoughts. And then about a page later, he writes, mindfulness brings to light experience in its pure immediacy. It reveals the object as it is before it has been plastered over with conceptual paint, overlaid with interpretations. Now, again, remember, the mind will think, it will have interpretations, but when mindfulness kicks back in, then it reflects, mental proliferation is being known, right? So it doesn't, it's not, I'm bad because there's mental proliferation. Whenever mindfulness kicks back in, even if I've been distracted, lost in the thought, when it kicks back in, then it's not entangled. It's just as aware, having been lost in thought is like this. And that's the neat thing. And I'll read something in a minute. Even when we're deeply distracted, really lost in thought, it may feel like we're a million miles away from the present moment, but I'm telling you, we're never, can't ever be far away from the present moment. I mean, intellectually, it makes sense, right? It's always here and now. So thinking that we're a million miles away is just that thought being known. But in that moment, the mind's attached or identified with that thought. So it looks like reality. I am a million miles away from the present moment, but it's never the truth. It's just what we call delusion, right? We believe our projections, the mental constructions, we believe what the mind says. So that's why the short practice is don't believe your thoughts, right? Because they're just thoughts. And sometimes they're relatively wise, and sometimes they're really silly, and sometimes they're despicable. But they're always just thoughts, even the sublime ones, the wise ones. Let me just read a little bit more here. So Bhikkhu Bodhi writes, to practice mindfulness is thus a matter not so much of doing, but of undoing. Not thinking, not judging, not associating, not planning, not imagining, not wishing. All these doings of ours are modes of interference, ways the mind manipulates experience and tries to establish its dominance. So I think it's important to say here that even though it's not doing that, it's also not trying to not do that. That's just another doing. So we're not trying to interpret, but we're also not trying to not interpret. If there's interpretation going on, awareness and wisdom goes, that interpretation is being known. If there's none of that mental proliferation, none of that thinking, none of that interpreting, projecting going on, then the mind notices the absence. Oh, the mind's quiet. There's not a lot of mental activity. It's quiet. Quietness is being known. Mindfulness undoes the knots and tangles of these doings. You know, it's like, some of you have heard me say this, mindfulness is like a universal solvent. And he writes, Bhikkhu Bodhi writes, it does nothing but note, watching each occasion of experience as it arises, stands and passes away. In the watching, there is no room for clinging, no compulsion to saddle things with our desires. There is only a sustained contemplation of experience in its bare immediacy, carefully, precisely, persistently. And he doesn't write this, but we could add in a relaxed, easeful way, right? Because that's a telltale sign we're starting to lose it when our practice feels forced, because using that simile of the mirror doesn't get tight. It isn't hard for the mirror because of its very nature. It's not stressful for the mirror to reflect what's going on in front of it. Even if it's a really complex thing going on, you're doing, some dance, some complicated dance piece in front of the mirror, it's effortless for the mirror to reflect what's going on in front of it. And that's the same thing. It's because you and I, we don't do the mindful awareness. We remember to recognize it. The problem is forgetting to recognize it. It's not that we're not trying hard enough to be mindful. It's that we've forgotten what it is, that it's already here to be recognized. That's the problem. So when we're struggling in our practice and we're just finding that we're lost in thought a lot of the time, it's because we go right to thinking I should do something as opposed to more contemplating what here and now is that awareness that the Buddha keeps talking about. Mark keeps talking about, and Shelley keeps, it's like, he's talking about awareness. Mindfulness, this, practice. It's like it can drive us crazy because we wrongly interpret it as something that somebody has to do. So right from the beginning, we're off. And then we get frustrated. And then we have real doubts about the practice. And we want to give it up. Or we get really tight because we've equated the instructions with focusing my attention. Because at least I know what I'm doing. I'm bringing my attention to this aspect of my experience and I'm holding it there. But that process of focusing attention isn't mindfulness. It's not necessarily a bad skill to have, And there is something about keeping, like we are remembering to keep awareness in mind, but awareness isn't the focusing. It's that quality of the mind that's here and now that is already capable naturally of knowing what the mind is knowing, being aware of what the mind is doing and knowing. So here's the passage I wanted to read from the Buddha when he was talking to his attendant, Ananda. Ananda was another monk, younger than the Buddha, and is actually the Buddha's cousin who ordained, after the Buddha's awakening, and for many decades served as the Buddha's attendant. And in the tradition, he's revered because evidently had an amazing memory. And because he was the Buddha's attendant, he heard a lot of the Buddha's instructions over the 45 years of the Buddha's teaching. And so a lot of the teachings that we have, not all of them, but a lot of them were heard by Ananda and then repeated to the other people who weren't necessarily at the talk that the Buddha gave. And so he was sort of the repository of so much of the Buddhist instructions. There are volumes that were recorded over those 45 years. And some of them systematized, of course, in later centuries or over the years. But basically, a lot of that came from Ananda and a few other people who, memorized and then helped other people memorize the teachings. They didn't write them down for 300 or so years after the time of the Buddha. They did have writing back then, but it was only used for sort of commerce, like keeping track of inventory and stuff like that. And spiritual teachings were thought to be too valuable to actually write down. So there was this really developed oral tradition back then. But anyway, here's one of the suttas, the discourses. The Blessed One said, "Now how, Ananda," and this is often what the Buddha would do, he would ask a question to the audience, in this case to Ananda, and then he'd go ahead and answer it himself. So the Blessed One, the Buddha said, "Now how, Ananda, in this training of the awakened ones, is there an unexcelled development of the 5 faculties?" So the 5 faculties are one of the ways. The Buddha had different maps, like you're studying the Eightfold Path. That's one of the central maps. The 5 faculties is another pretty central map that is used. The 7 factors of awakening, which some of you maybe were part of the Buddhist studies class this winter. We studied those. But the 5 faculties is a nice one. And maybe you've heard of it, but it's faith or confidence, energy, mindfulness, samadhi or concentration, and wisdom. And it's like an engine. We get faith or confidence because of the deepening of wisdom or insight. We see, understand a little bit more clearly the way things work, the kind of conditional nature, like how stress in my heart comes to be and how stress in my heart releases. And that builds some confidence. Oh, there's something to wake up to here, right? And when there's confidence, when there's faith, there's more energy. And when there's energy, we can build the momentum of keeping the present moment in mind, keeping awareness in mind. And when there's that, the continuity of awareness is what stabilizes, strengthens the power of the mind. That's the samadhi. Gets badly translated as concentration, as you know. And it's the power, the stability of awareness, the concentration that allows the mind to see more deeply what it hasn't seen yet about the nature, the conditional nature of how this neurotic burdened sense of me comes to be, and how in moments the whole thing implodes. And I might have felt really bound up and neurotic and needy and aggressive and, all the different ways that we can get tight. And then later, the heart might feel relatively light and unburdened and not oppressed in being a human being. And what wisdom does is sees how it comes to be, that suffering, and how it releases. And that just strengthens the faith and confidence. So the Buddha is saying, because this whole thing, inevitably, the engine of faith, energy, mindfulness, concentration, wisdom, as the Buddha says with the other maps of awakening, when this natural process of awakening is set in motion, it leads to awakening. And he uses, the example of a great river. In the same way, one of the great rivers, like the Ganges, he says, inevitably, naturally, unavoidably flows to the ocean. When you develop the 5 faculties, your heart, mind is going to gravitate towards full awakening, the unshakable release. Can't stop it. It's a natural process. When the supporting causes are there, awakening happens. When the supporting causes aren't there, awakening doesn't happen. And, we can bank on that. So he asks the question, what is this training of the wise ones that leads to the unexcelled development of these qualities that lead to awakening? And then he answers his own question. There is the case where when seeing a form with one's eyes, and this could go for any of our sense gates, the ears, hearing, smelling, tasting, touches, and even mental activity. So there is a case when someone seeing a form with the eye, there arises what is agreeable, what's disagreeable, or both agreeable, disagreeable, right? Sometimes a sight we see with the eyes is pleasant, sometimes it's unpleasant, sometimes it's mixed. Make sense? One discerns that this agreeable experience has arisen in me, or this disagreeable thing has arisen in me, or this mixed thing has arisen in me, and that it is compounded, right? It's conditioned, it's come to be due to causes and conditions. It's just an ordinary worldly conditioned sight or sound being heard, or thought being thought, or sensation being felt, or smell being smelt, or taste being tasted, right? So that's the first step, is that moment of mindfulness that realizes this is just this being known, and that this being known, that this and it's being known is arising conditionally. So don't make that too more than what it is. It's just like, oh yeah, when the conditions are such, like I'm sensitive to form, and I'm paying attention to that sensitivity, then a sight is going to be known, or a sound is going to be heard, or a thought is going to be noticed. And then he goes on, this is the real turn here. So when we can see that it's, this agreeable or disagreeable thing has arisen in me, and that it's conditioned or compounded, it's just an ordinary, worldly, dependently arising experience. When things are like this, then it's going to be this thing being known. But this is peaceful, the Buddha says. This is exquisite. That is equanimity. With that, the arisen agreeable thing or disagreeable thing or mixed thing, it ceases. And what he means by it ceases is the identification, the reactivity, it ceases. And equanimity takes its stance. Now, this is something we can see in our own experience when there's a little momentum. Like you're sitting, and let's say in a meditation, maybe even this evening, the sit you were doing, and you had a little continuity, you felt present with the breath or with the body, or with present moment experience. And then some agreeable or disagreeable or mixed. Let's say it was a thought or a memory arose in you. But there was enough wisdom there and mindfulness and wisdom. So when that thought, that seductive thought arose, maybe a painful memory from the past, wisdom thought, oh yeah, it's like this sometimes. It's conditionally arising, this memory. Sometimes this memory arises and it's just that feeling being felt, just that mental image being seen. It's just that memory being known. And then there's that switch where what becomes the object of awareness is the equanimity. Like, this isn't a problem that this memory has shown up. But now, in a sense, the memory's still there, but what the mind is really seeing is the balance, is the non-reactivity, the not being burdened by the memory. That's actually what's predominant. The memory's there, but it very quickly, it's not being fed because we're not dependent on the memory. We're aware of the equanimity, like just letting it be that memory being known. And then the Buddha goes on and he says, this is the interesting piece here. Just as a person with good eyes, having closed them, might open them, or having opened them, might close them. That is how quickly, how rapidly, how easily, no matter what it refers to, the arisen agreeable thing or disagreeable thing or mixed thing ceases and equanimity takes its stance. In the discipline of the wise ones, this is called the unexcelled development of the faculties with regard to any sense experience whatsoever, through any of the 6 sense gates: seeing, hearing, smelling, tasting, touching, the 5 physical sense gates, and the sense gates of knowing, mental activity. And so this is the power, he's really pointing to the power of mindful awareness, that at any moment, it is like Thich Nhat Hanh's book, one of the earlier books here in the West, written by Thich Nhat Hanh. Maybe some of you have seen it. The Miracle of Mindfulness, it was called. When I first started sitting back in the early 80s, it was still around because he wrote that, I think, in the 70s. And I saw that and I thought, oh, that's a little, that felt a little bit too much, like to say the miracle of mindfulness. But it really, there is this flavor of freedom in a moment of awareness. And it's what the Buddha is talking about, where when we realize that whether it's an agreeable experience, a disagreeable experience, so pleasant or unpleasant or neutral, mixed, when we realize it's just that being known, it's just that conditioned thing, experience being known, codependent, when all the conditions are the way it is, the mind is going to see this or hear this or think this. It's just that being known, can't be otherwise. And then you'll see that there's this possibility of being aware of the equanimity, of the non-attachment, the not having a problem of it. So it's the harmonizing and being peaceful with the condition, even if it's a disagreeable condition or a really nice condition. But what's there is the equanimity, is the being peaceful, not dependent, not needing it to last, not needing it to go away, but it will, follow its own course. But we're not dependent. And this is what we can practice, just even right now, of course, as I open it up I'll stop talking and open it up for discussion and your questions and comments from your own practice as we just unpack together. And I'm sure Shelley will continue for a few more weeks talking about wise mindfulness as one of the eightfold, part of the Eightfold Path, one of the limbs of the Eightfold Path. What it is and what it isn't. And I'll leave it there. And, with this size group, it's really okay for people just to unmute themselves, and nice to say your pronouns, your first name, maybe even where you're from, if Yeah, if you don't mind. Anybody feel like getting started? We have about 15 minutes. Hi, Rajesh.
Hi, Mark. My name is Rajesh, and I live in San Diego County. So I'm going to try I really have two questions, if you don't mind. The first question is, I'm just trying to understand something because what you're talking about in some ways is very difficult to understand. So when you say know that there is knowing, right? I guess that is you're just trying to explain to us that when you're aware, you know that you know. You're not saying you have to say to yourself, I know that I know. Am I right?
Yes. Yeah, there might be times when verbalizing, I know that I know. I mean, I might do it like a common way to do that might be the phrase, this is being known. And you could replace the word this with thinking is being known or hearing is being known. But the emphasis is more on is being known, right? Not so much the object, but that it's being known. There's an awareness that this is being known. But yeah, you can use a phrase, but you don't need to. And you certainly don't want to do it all the time, unless you're just working with that particular meditative technique where you do the mental note. But that's that's something to use when you're doing intensive practice for periods of time. And probably not for everyone. Certain mental personality temperaments, they can use that mental noting technique with great advantage, but it's not for everyone.
Okay. So if you don't mind, I'd just like to share an experience which just lasted a short while. And I'm trying to understand if maybe this is what you're really talking about. Is that all right?
Yes, please.
Okay. uh, so I was at the gym and I was doing a bicycle. And there were some workmen working on some electrical stuff. And I was observing them. And I realized subsequently, after a few minutes, that I knew exactly what they were doing. I understood why they were doing what they were doing, but I had no thoughts about it. And I still remember the things they're doing, but I did not think about it whatsoever. In other words, there's this realization that I was observing, or observation was happening, but there was no thought about it. And I guess this happened quite some time back. So now I'm trying to remember it, but it was almost like this observation without thought, but a total understanding of what was happening. So is that what you're really talking about?
Well, it might be related, but I think that phenomena happens, and it's the reason it's shocking, and it stands out enough for you, for example, to want to share it in the setting, Rajesh, is that we presume that the thinking mind is really the center and the initiator. It does stuff. So it's surprising to find that understanding exists independent of the thinking process, right? But understanding, most of the thinking, like when we understand something, because of our dependence on the thinking process, we'll think about what we understand and we'll mistakenly think, I understand because I think, I just thought it out. But actually, we understood, like you said, right? Because understanding is not necessarily conceptual. The thinking mind, the conceiving mind, is actually a relatively gross part of the mind. But we are just living addicted to a kind of grosser part of the mind, and it has all kinds of unfortunate reverberations. One is because we're so identified with the thinking process, we live as I think in one of T.S. Eliot's poems, we live a short distance from our life because we're identified with the conceptualizing process. Okay, buddy, you got to move. We're identified with the conceptualizing process and thinking that that's the center of the universe, when it's just a tool that happens to be around. So I think the reason it relates to the practice, Rajesh, is that that it can support the de-identification from the thinking process without being averse to it, without feeling like somebody's got to get rid of the thinking process. Just let it be that tool and recognize it's just one of the 6 things that are being known.
Okay. Yeah, thank you. So just so what I experienced was not what you were really talking about being aware. Am I right?
Well, the reason you caught that was because there was some balance awareness there, right? Because of that stability of awareness, the mind was relaxed. You weren't trying to be mindful. But the mirror of awareness was there, right? And so what that mirror revealed was understanding, and then noticing that understanding didn't, like, there wasn't thinking going on, right? That's what you said to us.
Yes.
Yeah. So that insight, that understanding isn't dependent on that cognitive process, was an insight. But the insight wasn't the awareness. The awareness allowed for the insight. The stability of awareness allowed for that insight. Does that make sense?
I think so. And so I really wasn't being mindful. This is more like an accident.
Well, see, here's the thing, and I said that at the beginning of the talk. We don't do the mindfulness, but we're definitely trying to build the momentum of mindful awareness, but we can't do it. Just like when you were riding that bike at the gym, you weren't doing awareness, but there was awareness. And the effect of that awareness was that you saw something, wisdom and awareness saw something that it normally doesn't see. You saw it more clearly, right? You're getting to know the mind. And it's always surprising because the mind, the nature of experience, is never what we think it is. What we think the mind is, how we conceive it, isn't the nature of the mind. It's not a conceptual awakening, right? So when we see something, it's shocking a little bit, like it was for you. All the little learning that happens.
Okay, thank you so much. I really need to think about this.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Oh, good. It looks like maybe Mary put in the link for the book, for Bhikkhu Bodhi's book. Other thoughts? We got a little time left. Reflections from your practice, like Rajesh, or questions that are emerging.
Where are we? Okay. Can I take off my mask? Hi, this is Kim. I don't know if you can see me.
Did you say Kim?
Yep.
Hi, Kim.
Hi. Yeah, I should turn on the light in the back. When we were going through that, it was really neat to have the feeling when you were mentioning whatever thought was coming to mind, something from the past, something painful or something fun or something neutral. It really centered to me how when it is a painful memory and it does come up, how when it works that it doesn't trigger us, but that it's just what it was. And we can then go on to the next thing, that we are then healing from that trauma. If it used to be something that kept us into a spin and made us really then go on and have to relive it over and over in our mind, or argue with the situation and get frustrated again, or the heart rate goes up, or any of that. And when that happens, when something that was so troubling and traumatic comes to mind, and then it can be let go of, it's like the miracle of really of trauma healing.
Yeah, that's a beautiful testimonial. It really, yeah, and more now in Western psychology and work, and the work being done that support people who are dealing with trauma in one way or another. Mindfulness is going to be a major part of that, because it allows us to hold, to be in the moment without like creating the possibility, like you said, Kim, of not doing the same thing that we've done before, which is sort of winding it up. And it lets whatever it is begin to unwind, because there's now that confidence to be able to feel what we're feeling. Because that mirror, it's going to reflect what that is, that unwinding, and the sensations, emotional sensations, bodily sensations. But there's a lot of power in that equanimity to just feel what's there to feel.
Yes.
And it's really that switch that the Buddha was talking about, where we're looking at the disagreeable thing, but then we realize I can be aware of the balance, the non-reactivity, the peacefulness with this object. And so that's what's the not feeding, not doing what we've done before with that painful sensation, let's say. And that's what allows the unwinding of the trauma and the healing of the trauma.
Yeah.
I'm glad you brought that up. Anything else you wanted to say, Kim?
Oh, well, just thank you for that. And it just really helped me relate kind of modern day healing or psychology with very old stuff, right? Like this has been going on for a long time with these teachings, but now they're actually coming up in a lot of things with like DBT, for instance. It really combines.
It comes right out of the practice, but is a really powerful therapeutic tool.
Yeah. And so being able to put that together, and then with that non-judgment, right? The image of what maybe happened is there, and we're not judging it as we might have in our heads. Okay, that wasn't a good thing. I'm not saying that was a great thing that happened, but it happened, and it's just something that happened.
Yeah, and right now it is that experience being known, and we learn to emphasize it's being known, and that's what gives the heart stability when difficult experiences are arising. It's being known. It's being known, and we're really taking that. To kind of personalize it, we're taking the position of the one who knows, the one who feels. And there's a lot of stability in that, but we won't know it until we just experiment with it. And that's what builds that confidence that we talked about. Well, I appreciate you sharing that, Kim. Really good to hear.
Thank you.
Yeah, sounds like you're doing good work. And we should probably wrap up. Thank you so much for coming. And I do have a couple announcements. Shelley's going to lead a half-day retreat this coming Saturday afternoon, 1 to 5. Plenty of space if you want to join in person at the city center or online. And then Shelley and Mesky and I will lead a workshop on Saturday, the 25th of March on emptiness. And it's called the Living the Practice Workshop. So we have, there's a lot of discussion time and small group work as we unpack the Buddhist teachings on emptiness and how are they functional in daily life. So that's the particular emphasis for that. And then Cecilia, Ramon, and I are going to do a day long on April 1st on resilience. And that's going to be at the City Center and online on Zoom. So join in for that. So many other programs too, of course. And again, thanks for coming, everyone. Feel free to unmute yourself if you want to verbally say hello and goodbye.
Thank you, Mark.
Thank you.
Thanks to everybody.
Thank
Thanks,
you,
Mark.
Mark.
Bye.
Thank
Good
you.
night, everyone. Thank you, Mark.
Thanks, everyone.